The train screeched into the little station at Ashford, a town so small the smoke from the engine seemed to swallow it whole. Clara stepped down onto the wooden platform with nothing but a satchel, pressed close to her ribs. She had left the city behind with its noise and choking grief, carrying only the ache of what she had lost. The silence here was heavy, stretching across fields and woods, broken only by the river that cut through the land like a scar. Locals whispered about that river. They said it carried voices if you stood near it at dusk. Some believed it was the dead speaking. Others claimed it was only the wind twisting through the trees. Clara didn't listen. She wanted a place where no one knew her name, no one asked questions, and no one remembered the sickness that had taken her family. The cabin she rented sat near the riverbank, a crooked structure of weather-worn wood and a sagging porch. Inside, dust lay thick over everything. But the hearth was solid, the roof didn't leak, and from the window she could see the wide current moving slow and endless. She set her satchel on the table, lit a lamp, and for the first time in months, allowed herself to breathe without the weight of city walls pressing in. That first night, Clara sat outside on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The moon glowed silver over the water, and the wind carried the smell of pine and damp earth. She closed her eyes, trying not to remember faces, voices, laughter that once filled her world. But then, faint as a breath, she heard something. Words, whispers carried by the current. Her eyes snapped open. The river shimmered, ripples catching the moonlight. And though she knew it was impossible, the sound seemed to call her name. Clara gripped the blanket tighter. Perhaps it was just her tired mind, worn thin by travel and loss. Perhaps it was nothing at all. Still, she did not sleep well. The whispers followed her into her dreams, and when morning came, she found herself staring at the river with a mixture of fear and longing, as if it held a secret waiting to be told. The cabin was quieter than Ruth remembered it ever being. She had lived alone long enough to grow used to silence. But this silence was different. It carried weight. The girl never made a sound except for the soft shuffle of bare feet against the floorboards, or the steady rhythm of her breath when she slept near the fire. Ruth tried to keep her days as normal as she could. She fetched water from the well, split kindling, and patched up the roof where last winter's storms had left gaps. The girl followed her sometimes, always watching, never speaking. She'd crouch near the chopping block, tracing strange patterns in the dirt with a stick, lifting her head only when the wind stirred the treetops, as if she were listening for something Ruth couldn't hear. One afternoon, Ruth found her standing at the edge of the woods, her small figure framed against the dark line of pines. The horse stood close behind her, ears twitching. "Best not wander too far," Ruth said gently. The girl didn't move. Instead, she lifted her arm and pointed into the trees. Ruth's eyes followed, but she saw nothing, just shifting shadows. When she looked back, the girl whispered for the first time since she'd arrived. Her voice was so faint Ruth almost thought she imagined it. "They're still there." Ruth felt a coldness settle in her chest. She stepped forward, touched the girl's shoulder, and guided her back toward the porch. She wanted to ask who they were, but the weight in the child's eyes stopped her. Some truths, Ruth realized, weren't ready to be spoken. That night, when the wind rattled the shutters, Ruth lit a lantern and sat awake in her chair. Outside, the painted horse stood motionless by the barn, watching the tree line as if guarding against whatever the girl had seen. For the first time in years, Ruth didn't feel like she was living alone. But that thought didn't bring her comfort. It brought her unease. The next morning, Ruth found the girl already outside, crouched near the barn. She was arranging small stones in a circle on the ground, her hands moving with care, her face calm but focused. Ruth watched from the porch, coffee mug warming her palms. "They mean something, don't they?" Ruth asked softly. The girl didn't look up. She pressed one last stone into place and stood back, her eyes fixed on the shape as though waiting for it to answer her. The painted horse snorted and pawed at the dirt, uneasy. Ruth stepped closer. "Is it a game, a map?" The girl finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "It keeps them away." Ruth's stomach tightened. She thought of the way the girl had pointed into the trees the day before. "Who?" she asked carefully. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she reached for a stick and drew strange symbols inside the circle. Lines that bent and curled, marks Ruth had never seen before. Then she dropped the stick and walked back toward the cabin, as if the matter was settled. That night, Ruth couldn't shake the image of those stones. She left the lantern burning low and sat by the window long after the girl had fallen asleep. The woods outside were dark and silent, but something about the quiet felt wrong, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Sometime past midnight, Ruth heard it, the sound of twigs snapping, too steady to be an animal. She gripped the rifle that leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. But when she peered through the glass, she saw nothing, only the circle of stones glowing faintly in the lantern light, untouched. She sat back down, the unease growing heavier in her chest. Whatever the girl was guarding against, Ruth had the terrible feeling it was already closer than either of them wanted to admit. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Ruth worked the ranch as best she could, mending fences, tending the horses, hauling water, while the girl lingered in the background, always watchful. She rarely spoke, but her presence was constant. Like a shadow Ruth couldn't shake. Each morning, Ruth found new circles of stones near the cabin. Some were small, some stretched wide across the dirt, all marked with those strange curling lines. Ruth tried not to disturb them, though they unsettled her more than she cared to admit. One evening, Ruth saddled her horse and rode the ridge, needing space to breathe. The late sun burned the sky red, and the prairie wind whispered low across the grass. From the crest of the hill, she could see the forest spread out in a dark mass, swallowing the horizon. For a moment, Ruth thought she saw movement at the tree line. Tall, thin figures standing perfectly still among the trunks. She blinked and they were gone. When she returned, the girl was waiting by the door, pale and rigid. "You went too close," she said, her voice sharper than Ruth had ever heard. Ruth tried to brush it off. "I was riding the ridge, that's all." The girl shook her head. "They see you now." That night, Ruth dreamed of the forest. She dreamed of trees that moved like living things, their branches twisting down to claw at the earth. She dreamed of whispers that wound through the dark, voices she almost understood. And when she woke, breathless and sweating, she heard footsteps just outside the window, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. She held her breath, clutching the rifle to her chest. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed against the walls. When morning came, the stone circles had been disturbed. The symbols were smudged, as if something had dragged a hand or a claw through them. Ruth realized then that whatever the girl feared wasn't just in her imagination. It was real, and it was coming closer. The following evening brought a storm. Heavy clouds rolled in from the west, thunder cracking so sharp it rattled the windows. Ruth hurried to latch the shutters, the rifle never far from her reach. The girl sat in the corner by the hearth, knees drawn to her chest, eyes wide and unblinking. The wind rose until it screamed against the walls. But beneath the storm, Ruth swore she heard something else, low, voices threading through the noise, chanting words in a language she couldn't place. She lit the lantern, its glow trembling across the cabin walls, and tried to steady her breathing. Then with a crash, the door flew open. Ruth spun with the rifle, expecting wind or rain. Instead, she saw tall, thin shapes standing on the threshold. They were darker than shadow, their edges blurred, their heads bent as if they were studying her. The storm wailed behind them, but the figures did not stir in its fury. The girl shrieked. She leapt to her feet and began to scrawl, frantically across the floor with a piece of chalk she carried in her pocket, her hand moving faster than Ruth thought possible. Circles, symbols, crosses, lines. The patterns she'd been making outside now spread across the cabin floor. The figures stepped forward. Their movements were slow but deliberate, and wherever they walked, the lantern flame shuddered and bent toward them as if pulled by a breathless force. "Don't let them in!" the girl cried, her voice breaking. "They feed on what is left behind." Ruth fired the rifle. The shot rang through the cabin, deafening against the storm. For a heartbeat, the shadows split apart like smoke, but they reformed just as quickly, drifting closer, their long fingers reaching out. The girl pressed her palms against the floor, her eyes glowing with something Ruth had never seen before, a fierce, almost unearthly determination. The chalk symbols began to pulse faintly as though lit from beneath. The figures halted. For the first time they seemed uncertain. Ruth didn't understand what she was witnessing, but she knew one thing with bone-deep clarity. The girl wasn't just running from these things. She had been fighting them all along, and now they were both trapped in the storm together. The storm raged through the night, rattling the roof beams until Ruth feared the whole cabin might tear apart. The girl's chalk markings glowed faintly on the floor, holding the shadowed figures back. But Ruth could see it. The symbols were fading line by line, as though the storm itself was washing them away. The girl's small hands trembled as she drew more, her chalk wearing down to a stub. "It won't last," she whispered, sweat shining on her brow. "They've been following me for weeks. They don't stop. They never stop." Ruth's throat felt dry as dust. "Why you?" she demanded. "What do they want?" The girl's eyes lifted to hers. They were dark, haunted, and much older than her years. "They want voices," she said. "The kind that don't have bodies anymore. They find the living to carry them." Ruth gripped the rifle tighter. She wasn't a woman to bend easy to fear, but those words sent a coldness crawling through her chest. She thought of her late husband, buried on the hill behind the cabin. She thought of the silences she had carried since his death. The shadows pressed against the invisible boundary of chalk. Their faces, or what passed for faces, stretching forward. Ruth swore she could hear whispers now, low and coaxing, sliding into her mind like water into cracks. They sounded like voices she knew. Her husband, her father, even her own voice calling her name. The girl gasped. "Don't listen. That's how they take you." Ruth shut her eyes, forcing the whispers back, and steadied her hands on the rifle. But her heart thudded with a terrifying realization. The storm would not last forever. The chalk would wear down, and sooner or later those things would find a way in. Then the girl said something Ruth hadn't expected. "There's another way. But it takes both of us." Ruth opened her eyes, rain dripping down from the roof onto her face. "Tell me," she said. The girl's hands hovered over the chalk as if afraid of her own words. "We have to give them a story. One so strong it leaves no room for them. If we speak it together, it binds them outside." Ruth's breath caught. "A story?" The girl nodded, desperate. "Yes, because they live in silence. They feed on emptiness, but words, real words, can hold them back." Ruth had never heard of such a thing. But she also knew there was no choice. So as the storm beat the earth raw, Ruth knelt beside the girl, her rifle across her knees, and began to speak. She told the story of her husband, of the land, of every hardship she had endured. The girl's small voice joined hers, weaving in her own tale, fragmented, trembling, but alive. And for the first time, Ruth saw the shadowed figures falter. The storm howled like a living thing outside, tearing at the world. But inside the cabin, Ruth's voice did not break. She spoke with a steadiness born of years on the frontier, of graves dug with her own hands, of winters survived when everything seemed set against her. The girl's thin voice wove through hers like thread, fragile but determined. The shadows hissed and reeled, their shapes bending as if the weight of those words pressed against them. The cabin shook, but they could not cross the circle. Ruth realized then that the girl had been right. The whispers were powerless when faced with something stronger. The truth of a life spoken aloud, not buried in silence. The girl's eyes shone, with tears as the last of the chalk burned, faintly on the floor, then faded away. Yet the figures no longer pressed forward. They hung at the edges of the cabin, shuddering, retreating into the storm until they were gone. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not empty. It was full, holding the weight of what had been shared. Ruth lowered her rifle and exhaled. The girl slumped against her shoulder, exhausted but safe. Outside, the storm broke, leaving the land washed clean under a pale dawn. Ruth opened the door and looked at the horizon. The girl stood beside her, no longer trembling. "You're not alone anymore," Ruth said softly. For the first time, the girl smiled. The cabin stood scarred but unbroken, and the shadows never returned. But the whispers left one truth behind. Stories have power. And sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to share them. If you've stayed with this story to the very end, then you know there are more tales waiting beyond this one. Subscribe and walk with us into the next shadow, the next mystery, the next voice that dares to speak against the silence.